Hello, this is Dr. John Mercer, and thank you for listening to this presentation. Thank you to the international community of scholars in kinesiology for the invitation to deliver this presentation during Student Research Week. It's a great honor. I'm Dr. John Mercer. I earned my Bachelor's of Science in Industrial Technology, which is a bit of engineering and management, at Buffalo State College back in the 80s. I did my Master's of Science in Exercise Physiology at the University of North Texas. And then I did my doctoral training in biomechanics at University of Oregon, completed that work in 1999, and I have been at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas since then, and I am currently a professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Nutrition Sciences. Today I'm going to talk with you about research that I've been part of and have led at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And it's important to know that any good research lab is really based on the students that are involved in the lab. So those of you who are listening to this presentation, your role as an undergraduate student or as a graduate student in a research lab is critical. You do a lot of the work, you ask a lot of the neat questions that often help refine experiments or to come up with new experiments to conduct. So really the students are the key to any good laboratory. And when I look for students to join the work that I do, I really look for students who have a passion for learning. So if you're looking at graduate programs and you're trying to enter a graduate program, I think it's really important to let whoever runs that lab know that you have a strong passion for learning. And that's really what research is about, is we're trying to learn something new about a particular topic. So today what I'm going to do is talk about physics and physiology of sport. Something I do a lot in the classes I teach is I always think terminology is critical. And we need to have common terms and definitions so that we all know what we're talking about. So physics is just a definition, knowledge of nature, understanding motion and behavior, and physiology is the scientific study of functions and mechanisms of living systems. These two things overlap very well. So the physics is all about nature, and physiology is how the human works, okay, in the way that we use physiology here. So I do a physics background of research I do, and I also use physiology a lot. And today I'm going to talk about sport. And sport, from a definition, is just something that's competitive, it's physical activity, and it has some sort of game associated with it. Now, the sport I'm going to talk about today is endurance sports. And the way that I'm going to present some information here is I'm going to rely on a research-based approach to understanding swimming, biking, and running. And I'm going to talk about some specific projects that we've done in our lab. And it all comes back to using the scientific method to understand something. The scientific method is an approach used in all different disciplines. We do lots of observations, we ask questions, we form hypotheses, which are statements we believe to be true, based upon what we know. Then we form an experiment, and our experiment is actually designed to try to refute our hypotheses or disprove our thoughts. And then we analyze that data and make a conclusion. And what we are looking for, and something I do quite a bit in, is I try to separate out anecdotal information from empirical information. Anecdotal informations are testimonies from athletes. Here's the drink I use, or here's the shoes that I wear to run in. That's anecdotes. Empirical information are experiments. The anecdotal information is extremely important because a lot of times it drives questions that we want to ask. And I'm going to try to introduce some anecdotes as we go along and show you how those anecdotes actually drove some of the experiments that we have. But at the end of the day, our research approach, we want to do empirical based evidence where we actually are conducting an experiment, collecting data objectively, and then trying to evaluate whether or not our thoughts are correct. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about how the research approach is used to understand triathlon, more specifically swim, bike, and run. Now, triathlon is a sport involving swimming first, then transitioning to the bike,
and then transitioning from the bike to the run. And these events, triathlon events, come at all different distances, some lasting less than an hour and some lasting upwards to 16, 17 hours or even multiple days. In my work, I have done research in swimming, individually, biking, and running, and I'm going to talk about those research projects in this presentation. And here's some of the work that I've done that I'll talk about in this category of triathlon. So in swimming, I'll talk about some work that we've done regarding drag forces. I'll talk about some work that we've done on muscle activity and even core temperature. I'll talk about some research we've done in the transition from the swim to the bike, and then also some work we have done and are doing and biking, from rolling resistance, VO2, power, looking at muscle activity again, and then finally talk about some research I've done in the running world and impact forces and energetic cost of locomotion and muscle activity.
All right, so we're going to start with swim. So lots of different strokes in swimming. So we think about competitive swimmers like Dr. Matsumoto, who's an excellent competitive swimmer. Breaststroking, I don't know. I just thought the polar bear picture was sort of cool. I don't research this type of swimming. So the type of swimming I'm interested in is open water swimming. So this is where you're in, this is San Francisco, this is Alcatraz Island, and this is the Golden Gate Bridge. And there's a famous swing where you get off a ferry and you swim back to shore. And it's a neat swim, but no line to follow on the bottom of the pool, no flip turns. You have to navigate which direction you go, and you can see by following this red line, it wasn't exactly a straight line. So I'm interested in this type of swimming. In fact, here's a video of somebody swimming at Ironman, Arizona. An Ironman is 2.4 miles, 4K swim, 180K bike ride, and a 26 marathon, 42-kilometer run, all in one day. This is the swim portion, and this is what the swim portion often looks like in a race. The water's murky. This person's doing breaststroke. This person's doing freestyle, cross-stroke, and I'm in a kayak actually volunteering and supporting them. And so it's a very different type of swim environment than swimming in a competition pool. And so this is the type of work that I'm interested in. So I'm going to go through each of these sports. I'm going to talk a little bit about the physics, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about physiology. And then I'm going to pull together, I'll demonstrate some, or talk a little bit about some of the projects we do. So swimming physics, what we do is a kinetic analysis of a swimmer. That's my terrible stick figure right there. But the force, we identify forces acting on the swimmer that include drag resistance, so the force that's slowing the swimmer down from water. The drag propulsion, which is the force that allows the swimmer to go forward. Gravity is actually pulling the swimmer down, and buoyancy force is pushing the swimmer up. We put all those forces into this equation, Newton's second law, sum of forces acting on the object equals mass times acceleration. And then we pick a direction that we're interested in, and I'm going to talk about horizontal movement of a swimmer moving forward. So the only horizontal forces that I need to concern myself with are these two forces. The resistance to moving forward through the fluid, and then the propulsion causing forward movement. I put that into this equation. Drag force minus drag resistance equals ma. All right? And I'm going to use this equation to try to understand how to swim faster. And so
I've had the pleasure of working with a wetsuit company on testing out the drag force while swimming in different types of swimsuits or swim skins for triathlon. I'm going to show a video of some work that was done in Mallorca, Spain, where an instrument, this is the company who designed, an instrument is put in the water, that's this right here, and each one of these red boxes is an instrumented force platform. So as the swimmer swims along there in the bottom lane, the swimmer grabs that box, and the force of propulsion is measured with each stroke. That's actually Hoop Toussaint. He's the co-owner of the company, also a researcher. And here's a couple of swimmers swimming along, testing out different types of suits. They're each wearing a different type of suit, and then they'll switch out the gear and swim again. And you can see here the person swimming along. And what this device does is allows for measurement of propulsion force. And when propulsion force is known, and the person's swimming, and we know the swimmer's acceleration and the swimmer's mass, we understand the drag force that's created by the gear worn. This is just some of the instrument here, doing some field work. This is Dr. Toussaint and myself talking about some swimming biomechanics. And this is the instrument in action. This is each bar represents a different pad that is grabbed as the person swimming along. And like any good research team, we have to take care of our equipment. So lots of washing the equipment, making sure that it stays functional.
So during swimming, this is a picture of the same device. Each one of these pads measures force. So it's like a force transducer. It's like your bathroom scale. You stand on the bathroom scale, it measures how much force there is from gravity pulling you down and how hard you're pushing on the ground. This is like a bathroom scale, but put this way, so that as the swimmer pulls on it, it's measuring force. This is force here, and this is each one of those pads. So this is grabbing the pad, and it's measuring how much force there is. That's the propulsion force. So back to our physics, this is our equation I already showed you. We have drag propulsion minus drag resistance equals ma. I'll put a little check mark over these two because we're measuring that stuff. We're measuring propulsion force and we're measuring mass and acceleration. So we have one unknown. If you like physics, we love equations with one unknown. Because if we have one unknown, we can then solve for that a parameter. And so I just rewrite that equation and be able to solve for drag resistance. So by doing all these measurements, I can actually figure out the resistance force that's present during this swimming. Now drag force is a fancy equation. I would not be a good biomechanist if I didn't put an equation up. So it looks terrible. But all that equation tells us is the resistance to moving forward is based on how dense the fluid is, how much frontal area there is, how well the fluid moves over the object, and how fast the fluid moves over the object. So if we know those things, we actually know the drag force. But collectively, I'm solving for that already by using this device. And when we use this device, we get data that looks like this. On this axis is drag force, and down here is velocity, or how fast the swimmer is swimming. And in this case, I'm demonstrating data from two different suits that were tested. So this is, and I'm just calling them suit 1 and suit 2 because these have not been released yet for retail. So I can't actually tell you what the suits are. So, but the suits were, we were trying different things in terms of putting a zipper on the front of the suit, or having sleeves on the suit, which is very common for triathlon, or having a zipper on the back. And so I don't remember which one this is, which version this is, but we have two different suits, and this is the drag force. So the faster we swim, the more drag force for both suits. But really what I want is the suit with the least amount of drag force. I want the least amount of drag force. So for this swimmer, by picking suit 2, they could have less drag force and ultimately swim faster because they're having less resistance to moving forward. It all makes sense. Well, this is just a way that we were able to measure that. And from this work, we were able to evaluate different combinations of suits or suit designs that had different material, different designs in terms of placement of the zipper, or different sleeves. and ultimately able to select a suit that had the least resistance to go forward. And as a swimmer, that's what you want. You want to have the least resistance to go forward, which means that any propulsion force that you can generate makes you go faster. So as I go along, I'm going to have these types of boxes. These are my sort of take-home messages. This is the applied part of my work. The applied part means that I'm coming up with answers that are useful. And so from this type of work, we can actually use the data to find the suit with the least amount of drag. Anecdotally, I was then able to pick a suit that worked best for me because I tested some different suits for myself, and then was able to say, okay, this is the suit that is fastest for me, and it may not actually be the suit that's fastest for anybody else either. So go on to physiology. So the other part, so that's the physics of swimming. Now I'm going to switch gears and do physiology of swimming, and I'm going to focus in on core temperature because I'm really interested in what happens with how warm we get when we exercise. We get warm when we exercise because we're taking all this chemical energy in our body, our fats, our carbohydrates, what have you, and we're transforming that chemical energy to mechanical energy. That's what causes us to move, generate a force. And we do that aerobically and anaerobically. But this conversion of this energy to that energy is not perfect. It may be 30% efficient. That other 70% of energy goes off into heat. That heat ends up heating up our body, all right? And that's what we deal with thermal regulation. What I'm interested in is there's different types of wetsuits that triathletes can wear. And anecdotally, triathletes often talk that they get too warm in this wetsuit because it's got full sleeves, it's neoprene, you get warmer in it. That's the anecdote, that's the story. Whereas if you don't have sleeves, the suit comes to here, the water's on your arms and it's a bit cooler. Well, I wanted to test that. So we actually did a study, and we're actually just in the process of submitting it for a manuscript, where we did core temperature in these different wetsuits. So the question we're asking is core temperature influenced by wetsuit design? How do we measure core temperature? We take that pill, which is like a large vitamin, swallow it, goes inside your stomach, and then it moves through your digestive system, and we're able to record core temperature while swimming with different wetsuits. And we've had 5 subjects do this so far. They all had to swallow the core temperature. They swam 500 meters at a self-selected pace in 25.5 degrees Celsius water, which is pretty warm. All right. There's another group that I work with in Norway. They're actually doing cold water temperature effects of swimming in wetsuits to see how core temperature changes. I'm actually interested in the warmer side of temperature. So you would think core temperature would go up, but here's what we've seen so far. This is core temperature on this axis. This is no wetsuit. This is the sleeveless wetsuit and the full sleeve wetsuit. No change in core temperature. No change. But here's the time that they swam, 9 minutes, 37 seconds, 8 minutes, 52, 8 minutes, 38. They actually swam fastest with that wetsuit, but did not have a change in core temperature, which is interesting, because you would think core temperature would have gone up. 2 things, or actually a few things that are going on here. Here's my core temperature was not influenced by wetsuit design. My take-home message, my applied message is wear the suit that's comfortable, and you went fastest, well, these swimmers went fastest in the full sleeve. Right? That was a good take-home message. We've got to be careful though, because we're only doing 500-meter swim, and we're only doing self-selected pace. So the brain is a wonderful thing. That if the brain starts to detect core temperature to go up, the brain starts to say, no, go slower. Don't recruit as much muscle so you don't generate more heat and go higher. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually follow up this study and try to go a longer swim, and we're going to go to a faster pace. And our hypothesis is core temperature will go up. And that's what we want to see. But so far, with the data that we've looked at, we're not seeing a change in core temperature with swimming in these different wetsuits. So the other part of this is physiology, is muscle activity. So we're also interested in, anecdotally, athletes will say that wearing a full sleeve wetsuit interferes with shoulder movement. Well, we have a way to measure that. We can put sensors on the muscles, and we can measure muscle activity while swimming in the water, which is fantastic because now it's a waterproof system. Dr. Masimoto and I have struggled for years to do EMG in the water, and it's not an easy process. So we did this project. We have people swim in wetsuits, and we got data that looks like this. This is EMG on the y-axis. This is time on the x-axis. This is the posterior deltoid muscle, so back of the shoulder, and anterior deltoid, front part of the shoulder. These are just the correlations between swimming without a wetsuit, with no sleeves on the wetsuit, or with full sleeves on the wetsuit. These correlations are all pretty similar, meaning that these patterns were all very similar to each other. Not perfect, but similar. And same thing, here's anterior deltoid. These correlations are lower, so these patterns weren't as similar as the posterior deltoid, but still overall similar amongst the different comparisons. So right now what we're looking at is the muscle patterns seem overall similar, but yet there's some unique differences in how these muscles fired with or without full sleeves on the wetsuit. So from this work, muscle activity pattern overall seems similar. These lines are parallel to each other. It was not influenced by wetsuit sign, but there are subtle changes in the wetsuit that might actually be really important. Some of these swims take people an hour and a half to do, so they're in these wetsuits for an hour and a half. Whereas this is maybe 8 seconds worth of data. These subtle changes may be small at this stage, but if you do that for an hour and a half, maybe those changes actually accumulate to being a big factor. So we're saying right now that yes, similar, but there are changes in the pattern that maybe over time may accumulate and actually be a factor to deal with. Take home message, wear the wetsuit that's comfortable and practice swimming in that wetsuit. You need to learn how to swim in that wetsuit, because without a wetsuit or with a wetsuit can be quite different in terms of muscle activity. All right, so now in a triathlon, we've got to go from the swim to the bike, and so we have a transition. And so you have this wetsuit on, and you have to exit the water, and you have to take this wetsuit off, and ultimately get on the bike. The question that people have had is, should I take the wetsuit off and carry it? Should I take the wetsuit off halfway down? This is a terrible picture, halfway down, or do you leave the wetsuit all the way up? And transition from the water to your bike. So this is just a picture of where all the bikes are. These are different runners running along, trying to go from the swim to the bike. Well, we actually did a study on this. We had an undergraduate conduct this study. What is the best way to run with the wetsuit? We ran without a wetsuit. We had subjects run carrying a wetsuit in the arms. We had the subject wear the wetsuit fully up and halfway down. Very common ways that people would go from the water to the bike. We did 20 subjects on this, 4 conditions, and we measured physiology. We measured rate of oxygen consumption. And interestingly, oxygen consumption really didn't change much at all for while carrying it in hand or full, but it actually, by wearing the wetsuit halfway down, was about 7% greater than running without the wetsuit. So carrying it, or excuse me, wearing it halfway down, like this picture, wearing it halfway down was actually the hardest to do. Whereas if you ran with it in your hand or didn't take the wetsuit off, you did not have a negative influence on VO2. It was similar to running without the wetsuit. Down here is stride frequency, because we were also interested in did they change the way they ran. And so we measured stride frequency. This is on this axis, and this is the no wetsuit, in hand, full, and half conditions. And you can see these are just marks that there were differences. That if you ran with the wetsuit fully up, or if you ran with it halfway down, you changed the way you ran. All right. So what's the take-home message from this work? Well, runners ran different in these different conditions. You need to practice running with the wetsuit or running in the wetsuit. So I actually tell triathletes that I work with is figure out, do you want to run in the wetsuit fully up, which is probably better than wearing it halfway down. Or if you want to take the wetsuit off, hold it in your hands. So you have two real close ways to, or quick ways to try to transition to the water. And then I also tell athletes determine when to take the wetsuit off. Do you take the wetsuit off right after getting out of the water and then carry it? Or do you run fully up and get as close to your bike and then take the wetsuit off at that point? Those are probably the two best ways, based upon the data that we have, to run with the wetsuit versus putting it halfway down and running to the bike that way. All right, so now that was the transition. Now we're in the bike portion of the triathlon. And this is some really neat work that we're doing on cycling. We do our kinetic analysis of biking, and the first thing we do in the kinetic analysis is we identify the forces acting on the bike, just like we did with the swimmer. We have our propulsion force that makes the bike go and the cyclist go forward. Gravity, which is a real big issue if we're going uphill, then we call that a slope resistance force. Air resistance, which is now the same equation as the drag force that we saw for swimming, but now the fluid moving over the object is air. And then we have rolling resistance. This is what we're really interested in right now. This is that force right here acting on the wheels to slow the bike down. So if we just pushed the bike and it was able to not fall over, that bike eventually would roll to a stop. And it would roll to a stop due to rolling resistance. And we're really interested in having the least amount of rolling resistance in order to go as fast as possible on the bike. So we take those forces in our kinetic analysis, we put them in our equation. Sum of the forces acting on the object equals ma. Here's our different forces. Propulsion, causing forward movement. Slope, if we're going up a hill, it's going to slow us down. Air resistance, drag force, and then the last one, rolling resistance. That last one is the one that I'm really interested in for the work that we're doing right now. The work that we're working with this company, Flow Wheels. So we do a lot of partnerships with companies, and we are measuring a whole bunch of things here while riding outside. And the device we're using is this device right here. All right, it's a $10,000 or 100,000 yen device that measures air resistance. It's like a device that would be found on a plane. It actually measures GPS data, so it measures how fast the bike's going, whether or not the bike is going uphill or downhill. So this device and that computer talk to each other. And what we're interested in is trying to figure out the least amount of rolling resistance, and we are testing out different combinations of how wide the wheel is, how wide the tire is on the wheel, and how much tire pressure there is. So we're manipulating three things, okay? So wheel width, how wide that wheel is, how wide the tire is, and how much air we're putting into the tire. And then we use this equation, and what we're doing, let's see if I got it. I'm measuring propulsion force, because actually I have a device in the rear wheel, power meter. Does anyone have a power meter in a bike? Okay, this is a device we put in the rear wheel to figure out how much propulsion we're generating. The slope resistance force is measured by this device. Air resistance is measured by this device. And mass times acceleration, we're getting from this device that has GPS data. So my equation, I have all those known, I have one unknown, and that's perfect. Okay, as a biomechanist, that's what I like to have, is an equation with one unknown. Now I can solve for that. All right? So I'm measuring all those things, I'm manipulating these things, and I'm able to get rolling resistance. This is a project that we're going on right now. We actually went out and collected some data. We submitted this for ACSM to present. We took a bike out and we did one wheel width, one tire width, but 3 tire pressures. All right, the 3 pressures we put in the tire were 100 psi, 70 psi, and 40 psi. We did those measurements of, that I mentioned in the last slide, and this right here, in essence, represents rolling resistance. We call it coefficient of rolling resistance because that's one part of the equation for rolling resistance, but in essence, it's the force that's causing us to slow down while biking. And the way we did this, we used a stretch of road where we hit a certain speed and then we coasted down and we did all our measurements while doing what we call a roll down test. All right, so what do we have here? 100 PSI, we've got, we normalize the data to this value. 70 PSI, 95.7% less, or about 5% less rolling resistance with 70 PSI. But then when we went all the way down to 40 PSI, which is really a soft tire, that rolling resistance went greater than what we saw at 100 PSI, so about 20% greater. So the least amount of rolling resistance ended up being about 70 PSI in the tire. Now, if you're a cyclist, a lot of cyclists tend to pump up their pressure maybe to 120 PSI. You try to put lots of tire pressure into, or a lot of air pressure into the tire. The data that we're coming up with is you don't want to do that. You actually want less pressure in your tire. You don't want to go too low, because now rolling resistance is going to start going up. But you've got to find that optimum range for pressure. So rolling resistance lowest at 70 PSI versus 100 or 40 PSI. And when I get back to Las Vegas, we're going to continue this type of work and do some more. So what's the take-home message? You've got to find the optimum tire pressure. And what I tell my cycling friends and my triathlete friends is you no longer should be pumping up your tires to high pressure. All right? That often was the thought, that you want as high a pressure as possible, but that's not actually the case. You want to have a lower pressure, but you got to be careful not to go too low. So ultimately, that device that we're using now is going to be sold, and people are going to buy that device to be able to do this type of test. All right, so the other cycling work that we're doing cycling physiology. So we bring cyclists in the lab and use a trainer and do some work, and we have them breathing into our mask, and we measure oxygen consumption. The test that we're doing right now is we do a graded exercise test. This is VO2 on this axis and time down here, and this just represents the graded part of the intensity for the cycling test. The red line represents the power, red line represents VO2, and this represents heart rate. And as any good graded exercise test, we see a nice general increase in VO2. Well, during this test, we're also measuring power, and that's what's illustrated over here. This is oxygen consumption and power. This is how much power the cyclist is generating. This is how much power the cyclist is generating. And there's a nice relationship between cycling power and VO2. This is nice because when a cyclist is out in the real world, they've got a computer that talks to their power meter that's on the bike, and they're able to use that power to, in essence, predict what VO2 is, and then design a training program around that information. And along with that, our physiology, the other work that we've done is looking at muscle activity while biking indoors on a trainer versus biking outdoors. Anecdotally, athletes would typically talk about whether or not, if you bike on a stationary bike inside, whether or not it's the same as biking outside. So we actually tested that, and we had people bike on a trainer, and then we also had them bike outside. We looked at muscle activity of a number of muscles of the lower extremity, and we had them do a self-selected intensity of 3 different levels of intensity, and we measured cycling power, and we looked at muscle activity. We were interested in whether or not there was a difference in muscle activity while riding on the trainer and over ground. This first slide is how much power they generated at 3 RPE levels, rating of perceived exertions. And interestingly, riding in the trainer and over ground, they actually reached the same amount of power for an RPE of 11, same amount of power at RPE at 13, and 15, whether they're cycling on a trainer or over ground. So power increased as RPE increased, and power was not different between training using a trainer versus over ground. So that was actually one part that was really interesting. So they're generating the same amount of power. Anecdotally, athletes would talk that maybe power was different if you go at an RPE of 11. We actually demonstrated that wasn't the case. This slide's a little complicated, but what this is EMG for the biceps femoris, so hamstrings, rectus femoris on the quadriceps, and vastus lateralis, the outer part of the quadriceps as well. This is the same study. These are data from the 3 intensity levels on the trainer and 3 intensity levels while riding outdoors. So same amount of power, indoors and outdoors, at each of these intensities. And interestingly, same amount of muscle activity. So for the biceps femoris, for the rectus femoris, and the vastus lateralis. Muscle activity increased with intensity, both indoors and outdoors. Muscle activity was not different between riding on a trainer or over ground. So this is great information. As a cyclist, that means I can use a trainer and I can simulate outside riding and by using my trainer. So using a trainer replicates muscle activity while cycling outdoors. Great take-home message for cyclists. All right, the last leg of the triathlon, we're on the run. And just like swimming, the running that I'm interested in may not be elite level running. All right, so I'll show this video here, which is down in Ironman, Arizona. I was just watching a bunch of people run. And here's a runner, and sometimes both feet are in contact with the ground, sometimes they're not, and this is a person actually walking the marathon portion of the run. So something I like to keep in mind is that the work that I do is not always elite athletes. Sometimes it's what I call working with mere mortals. People like us who, I want to know how to go faster. I'm not running a 2-hour marathon. Maybe I want to try to get under 4 hours, and that is a different type of question of how to run faster for a 4-hour person trying to do a marathon versus a 2-hour marathon. All right, so running physics, we do the same exercise here. We identify the forces acting on the runner. In this case, I've got the ground reaction force pushing up on the runner, and I've got gravity pulling down on the runner. I don't really deal with air resistance for running. We can if we have a strong headwind, and that is actually something we have to account for running outside. And then I put those forces into either the horizontal direction or the vertical direction and try to do my analysis with that. I'm going to show you some quick data for vertical, the vertical motion for looking at physics. And to do this work, we have people run across a force platform, which measures the ground reaction force. And when we do that, we get a data set that looks very much like this. This is force on this axis, time on this axis. The person's foot strikes the ground here, and the person's toe comes off the ground over here. And that's a very characteristic curve of a ground reaction force during running. The person hits the ground, and they have to manage that impact with the ground. And one part of why we think runners get injured is because of this sudden impact force that we see during running. I've done quite a bit of work on factors that influence that impact force, and this is just one study that I'm showing some data here on. This is impact force over here. This is velocity, and what this data tells us is that as we run faster, the impact goes up. Makes sense. So as we run faster, we're hitting the ground harder. We have to manage that force as we're going along to continue to run or ultimately to prevent injury. Something that the shoe industry has grabbed onto is they are constantly trying to design shoes to reduce that impact force. So we recently did a project where we're looking at extreme cushioning shoes, something with lots of cushioning versus a normal trainer shoe. And we had an undergraduate student do this project, and this was Mr. Miles Mercer, who this was his project that he worked on while at UNLV, and received funding over the summer to pull this project together. So this is running economy, or running in shoes categorized as maximal cushioning. We were interested in whether or not, by running in soft shoes, whether or not VO2, rate of oxygen consumption, would go up, or if it would go down, or if it would stay the same. So anecdotally, people would say these shoes are heavy, they're soft. We know if you run on soft surfaces that it's harder. So if you run in sand or if you run in snow, the rate of oxygen consumption will go up. It's harder to run on soft surfaces. So anecdotally, people would say that these were bad shoes to run in. Well, we had noticed that there were actually quite a few people have adopted using this shoe. In fact, if you look at Ironman shoe count, a lot of athletes will use this type of shoe in distance running. So we had 10 subjects do this study. They ran 3 speeds in these shoes, 2 different shoes, and they ran 10 minutes per condition, and we measured VO2. And again, this is Miles as the lead author, and I'm the last author, so that's sort of neat. Here are the data. This is VO2 on the y-axis in mLs per kg per minute, and this is the slower speed, the speed that they wanted to run at, they self-selected that, and then a faster speed, and then these are the 2 shoe conditions. This is the control shoe, and this is the maximum cushioning shoe. And what did we see? We actually saw no influence of a shoe type on VO2. What that means is that the VO2 did not change when when subjects used 2 different shoes, which is really an important message to take home from this. So VO2 increased with speed, which is very common, but VO2 was not different between shoes. Our take-home message, our applied message, was using maximum cushioning shoes did not negatively influence VO2. It didn't make it better, it didn't make it worse. It didn't influence it at all, which was really an important observation that we made.
The last category of research I'm going to talk about is some work that I've done in the body weight support area. Body weight support involves running in the water, in this case running in deep water where the person's not touching the bottom of the pool, or running in a treadmill that lifts you up while running. In our lab we have an Ultra G treadmill. In this treadmill you wear a sort of a pair of shorts that fit into a bag that sort of like a kayak, and this bag actually gets pumped up with air, and as it pumps up it lifts the runner upwards, and we can set the treadmill to have different amounts of body weight support, from 10% body weight support all the way down to 80% body weight support. And we've done a lot of work in this area, and I'm actually just going to touch on it a little bit because it is interesting. It is a little different. It does come into play with triathlon because triathletes do get injured, and a lot of athletes want to continue to run. And when they want to continue to run, I often talk with them, and others do as well, about running in the water or running using a body weight support treadmill. And based on the work that we've done, we've looked at muscle activity, we've looked at energetic cost of running with different levels of body weight support, and I'm just going to cut to the chase on these results. This is some EMG work from a couple of different studies. What we have been able to identify is that muscle activity and VO2, rate of oxygen consumption, decrease as you increase body weight support. That makes sense. Muscle activity and VO2 increase with speed for any level of body weight support. That's actually good information, and that's what this bottom graph actually illustrates, is those lines keep going up, meaning that the muscles are getting more active as running speed is increased for each body weight support. And then the other thing that we've identified is muscle activity patterns are very similar for moderate body weight support, but unique when high levels of body weight support are used. So when people use the Ultra G, we actually tell them not to go down to but 20 to 40% their body weight, or 80 to 60% body weight support, because they start running quite differently when they reach those levels of body weight support. And same thing in running. Running in the water, what we've identified is that you have to run at a much higher intensity in the water to simulate running on land. But those are good pieces of information for an athlete to know if they're going to use body weight support to either rehab an injury or to supplement their current run training program. So body weight support is a good way to reduce the stress on the body. Muscle coordination is similar for moderate body weight support levels, so you can use this as a way to augment or replace some part of your run training program. But at high levels of body weight support, muscle coordination starts to change and it becomes a different type of exercise at that point.
So that's sort of my summary of swim, bike, and run research that we've done at UNLV. And take-home message for the applied part of the presentation. Use the fastest wetsuit for our races. So if I swim fastest in my full sleeve, use that. Don't worry about core temperature and don't worry about muscle activity. It's better to try to go as fast as possible. Either take the wetsuit off right away or run with it fully up when you're trying to get to your bike. Don't use maximum tire pressure and don't use minimum tire pressure. You don't want it too soft, you don't want it too hard. You got to find that tire pressure in between that actually reduces that rolling resistance as much as possible. You can use a bike trainer to stimulate biking outdoors. Running in shoes with maximum cushioning does not negatively influence running economy, so pick those shoes that you're comfortable running in and don't worry about that. And use moderate amounts of body weight support. I think is a good way to train. So this is a mixture of studies that, well, this is my applied message and taken from our empirical data. We do some other work in other sports as well. I thought I'd put up just two that you might find interesting. Right now we're working with some Ultimate Fight Championship fighters, mixed martial arts, and we're measuring how much force they're generating while doing different chokeholds. So they were interested in knowing those data, so we actually spent some time to do that. This is just force on this axis. This is just 3 different chokeholds that the mixed martial arts athletes perform, and we were able to identify which technique generated the most force to be able to chokehold somebody and maybe submit them or to have them pass out. And then some other work we're doing with Cirque du Soleil. We have their artists come in to the lab, and then we try to do some movements, or have them do their movements and then try to do some measurements. You can see he has different instruments on him here, and he's going to do this task, I'll show you in a second, above our 2 force platforms so we can do a kinetic analysis of this movement. And this was the task that he did. This is one of them. He does this type of movement in a show on Las Vegas. And so he wanted to know what forces he was experiencing while doing this task, as well as some other tasks as well. So he came over to the lab and did this movement and a whole bunch of others as well. So it's sort of a fun project, but very hard to actually study this type of movement because it's so complex.
So let me summarize this presentation and summarize this applied research approach that I've taken over these years. You know, I think what's most important from a research perspective is to find things that are interesting to you. In my case, I do triathlons. I enjoy participating in them. I actually got into kinesiology because of my interest in trying to go faster and further in triathlon, and that led me down different educational programs. So find things that are interesting to you. Then start asking questions. How to go faster, how to swim faster, how to bike faster, how to run faster, how to train better. All these, what to eat. There's all different types of questions that can be asked, even about triathlon. I've really focused in on biomechanics and physiology interests that I have in this presentation, but ask questions. And then start trying to answer those questions. What do you think? A lot of times when I meet with students, I talk with them about the interests that they have, the questions that they have, and then I ask them what their thoughts are. And once you have thoughts, then you start trying to design experiments to see if those thoughts are correct. So you do some measurements. You have subjects come in and do different things, different procedures in a laboratory. You use different instruments to measure different aspects of the movement. And then you check and see whether or not you were right. You analyze your data. You use your statistics. You compare different conditions. You compare different responses. And you see if your answer was correct or not. And once you have that, then you ask more questions, or you ask the question differently, or you decide to design a different experiment. You reevaluate your thoughts, and then you continue to go around. And I hope you see that that's what I've done over the course of my career in looking at triathlon. I've asked questions about swimming, about biking, about running, and then about triathlon as a whole. And I enjoy that, and it makes it easy for me to come into work. makes it easy to teach classes and to work with students. And ultimately, I want to find answers that are useful. This is the applied nature of the work that I do. Is I am trying to find answers to help triathletes or swimmers, bikers, and runners go faster. So I do need to give a big shout out to the current crew of students that are working with me, and they have each done either a segment of a triathlon or have taken on an entire triathlon. And funny thing is, each time I've interviewed one of these students to whether or not they'd come here to UNLV, I asked them which segment of a triathlon really they would do. They'd give me an answer. And then when they came here, they didn't realize I was actually serious in having them participate in some race. I really believe in being engaged in the sport that you're interested in order to ask questions that people really want to know answers to. So thank you again. Thank you to the organizers of this conference. It's been an honor to be part of this. And thank you for the time to listen to this presentation.